What's up, Buckeye fans? It's Patrick Murphy from Bucknuts and 24/7 Sports here for another episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. We are in the midst of the waiting period between the end of the regular season / conference championship weekend and the start of the college football playoff, which will begin over the weekend. The Buckeyes obviously will not play for another couple weeks as they head into the quarterfinals, thanks to that first round bye. But we will get playoff games this weekend. Bowl games have already started, so we're getting some taste of it. But I wanted to do what will probably be a little bit shorter of a Bucknuts Happy Hour this week. I thought about including this in last week's episode, but decided to do it separately. I'm going to dive into picks for the college football playoff, go through the whole bracket, and kind of lay out how I see these games going, who makes it how far, and who ends up being crowned national champions. Before I get into that, if you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure you hit the bell for alerts and turn on notifications so you get all of our videos, not just these podcasts, but the videos we do, interviews, all of that stuff that we do throughout the season. And we will have plenty more of those next week when we start to meet with the football team again, but we've got some basketball stuff, a big basketball game this weekend as Ohio State plays North Carolina in the CBS Sports Classic. And then, as I said, the Buckeyes will be back. We'll do interviews Monday next week. We'll have some stuff going into the holiday, and then we'll head down to Dallas for plenty more at the Cotton Bowl. So do that. If you're listening on a podcast platform of choice, please make sure you leave a 5-star review and turn on notifications so you get alerts when we send out or when we upload our podcasts. So let's get into it. So first of all, overall, and I touched on this a little bit last week, but I wanted to give some thoughts on the overall bracket before we get into the game by game. For the most part, I think the selection committee did a fine job. Like, I know there's a lot of complaints, so to speak, about, obviously Notre Dame not getting in, other teams over the last year or so that have had issues with how this is going. I know people have issues with the playoff show and things like that. But I think for the most part, you got it right. I think you look at these first round games, James Madison, Oregon, the number 5 seed. The winner of that will play Texas Tech. Alabama, I think you could argue that they could have been left out with 3 losses. I get that one of their losses came to a team that they'd already beaten this season in Georgia. Do I have that right? Let me double check. Yeah, they beat Georgia 24-21 earlier this season. So, those losses kind of offset. I do think there was an argument for Notre Dame over Alabama. There's always going to be arguments, regardless of how much you expand this to. There's going to be arguments. There's going to be conversation. Who deserves to be in, who does not. Ole Miss, Tulane. I know there's a lot of talk. Nick Saban coming out today saying he thinks the group of 5, group of 6, whatever we're calling it these days, should have their own playoff. I disagree with that. We're playing the same sport. I know he used the AAA baseball, but those are completely separate leagues. That's a minor league. This isn't a minor league unless we want to change everything. They are all playing FBS football. So they're just not in a conference that we have deemed better than others for one reason or another. So I'm okay with Tulane being in. They'll go on to play Georgia, who's the number 3 seed. I think you could make the argument that it would have been better for Ohio State, as I talked about last week, for the Buckeyes to drop to 3 and play the winner of Ole Miss, who deserves to be in but doesn't have a head coach and the staff is all shaken up, or Tulane, again, group of 5, group of 6 team, rather than Texas A&M or Miami. The debate with Miami was Notre Dame was ranked ahead of them all season, despite being, since the first playoff rankings came out, despite being the team that beat them week 1. So I understand that argument as well. I think it makes sense for Miami to be in. I definitely think Notre Dame has an argument, but I'm also not sure, given how things played out and the ACC and not having a conference champion there that deserves to be in the playoff or was ranked high enough to be in. These are the rules we've set in place. Can it change? Should it change? I think you can make that argument. but I also think you've got to play by the rules we've got. So with that, let's get into how these games, at least in my opinion, will shake out. We'll just start in order of when they will be played, and that is Alabama against Oklahoma on Friday, December 19th. That's 8 p.m. on ABC. I think this is interesting. These two teams also played earlier this season. They played at, let me make sure I get this right. They played at Alabama with the Oklahoma winning 23-21. So we have, this wasn't that long ago. It was, when was this game played? Played November 15th. So, a couple months ago at this point. I do think with Oklahoma, you had John Mateer still sort of coming back from that hand injury he suffered early in the season. It was not the cleanest of games. The Alabama turned the ball over 3 times, if I remember correctly. So they tried to give that game away with turnovers and some sloppy play just in general. This game is probably certainly one of the hardest, one of two. I'll get to the other one obviously to pick because I think neither of these teams is really all that good. Like if you're asking me, can either of these teams win the national championship? I don't think so. We'll get to the next. They're playing Indiana in the next round, the number 1 team in the country. So the result of this game may not matter all that much, other than you get a win in the playoff. But I am going to go, and I've debated back and forth on this quite a bit. But I am going to go with with Oklahoma winning the game at home. I think a healthier John Mateer. I think this defense can get the job done against Alabama. I just, 3-loss Alabama. I know they might be a little bit healthier than the last time we saw them in the SEC championship game. There's nothing about that team that gets me excited. And not that Oklahoma is all that exciting either, but I think that Oklahoma just has enough. Brent Venables and that defense. To me, Oklahoma deserved to be in, Alabama didn't. And that's ultimately what it came down to. Now, anything can happen on any given day, but I think Oklahoma gets that win. Then we go to the Miami Texas A&M game. And obviously this is one that Ohio State fans will be watching closely because the winner goes on to play Ohio State. It is at Texas A&M. And I think there has been a lot of discussion, and I think I would be in agreement that Miami upsetting Texas A&M would be the best situation for the Buckeyes because obviously the quarterfinal game will be played in the Cotton Bowl. Cotton Bowl is about 3 hours drive from College Station where Texas A&M plays. So from a home field advantage standpoint, the idea of facing Miami versus Texas A&M, I think that's pretty clear. You'd rather have Miami in there. This is the second most interesting game. So we're going to get Friday night and Saturday early afternoon. We'll get the 2 best games, I think, of the weekend right off the bat. And you then go about figuring out where you go from there. And the rest of the games, maybe they'll be closer than people expected or expect. We'll talk about that. But I think that you have 2 of the best games played out quickly as opposed to last year when you had that Ohio State Tennessee game as the night game on Saturday night, which that would have been the way I would have done this Miami Texas A&M game. But I guess it's probably because they're playing on New Year's Eve. They wanted to get them in early. I am going to go Miami. I don't know how many people are picking Miami to beat Texas A&M. For me, I think Miami is just overall more talented. You look at Texas A&M's schedule, there's not a lot, and I've started to watch both of these teams in preparation, but there's just not a lot about Texas A&M that you can point to and say, this is the reason they're going to make a run or even win this game. They beat Notre Dame in week 3. It was at Notre Dame. They won 41-40. If you remember that game, there was a holding call. There was a non-holding call on the go-ahead touchdown for Texas A&M. Otherwise, they lose that game. They're probably not even in this conversation. The only other team that was even in consideration for the college football playoff that Texas A&M beat was Texas, and that was the last game of the regular season. And they lost at Texas 27-17. We watched that game. It was a Friday night game before the Michigan game. We watched that in our hotel room and came away not very impressed with Texas A&M. They did play LSU and Missouri late October, early November. Both of those teams were ranked at the time. Neither team was impressive after that. And the wins weren't dominant by any stretch. They beat LSU 49-25. That's an LSU team that fired its coach. Obviously, Missouri 38-17. So, at the time, those probably looked like better wins than they were. But, struggling against South Carolina, had to make that big comeback. Now, credit for that big comeback. But for me, I don't think there's a ton here that tells me they're going to beat Miami. And when you look at Miami, I think Carson Beck on his day is a really good quarterback. He had the second highest completion percentage in the country behind Julian Sayin going into bowl week or going into after conference championship week. I think when he plays at his best, can be one of the best quarterbacks in the country. He's just very inconsistent. And then you've got the running backs, and they use a couple, but Mark Fletcher's the name to know. I think he's talented. He's a guy Ohio State wanted. If he gets going, he can be problematic. Malachi Toney, young player who is explosive, sort of a smallish guy. To me, there's just more weapons on this team. And defensively, I think they can do a little bit more that might cause some teams issues. So I think it'll be a close one. I think it'll be fun. That game is Texas A&M's favored by 4. I'm no gambling expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I could certainly see. I'm picking Miami to win that game, but at the very least, I think Miami keeps it closer than that. So I've got Miami going in and playing Ohio State in the quarterfinal. And then you've got Ole Miss Tulane in playing at Ole Miss. Again, another rematch of a game we saw earlier this season. Ole Miss won that game handily, 45-10. But I think if you watch that game and you compare it to Tulane the rest of the season, Tulane benched its quarterback. Pulling up the stats here, it was a really low output in their passing attack. He threw for 56 yards before he was benched, and Sullivan came in. Retzlaff got benched. And to me, I won't pretend to be a Tulane expert or to have watched all of Tulane's games, but if you just look at the stats and you watch any of their highlights, this seemed, now they were playing a much better team, but this seemed like a different Tulane team. So I'm still picking Ole Miss to win, though I think the combination of Tulane knowing what they have to do, having done it once already, and Ole Miss's mess that they have at a coaching staff where you had some of the guys already leave to go to LSU. Now they're coming. Some of them are coming back. It just seems like a mess. Again, I think this should have been where, granted you would have had to drop Ohio State 2 spots, but I think this would have been a much better path for Ohio State. I still think Ole Miss wins, but I don't think it's as close, or I think it's closer, than the first game. The spreads got Ole Miss favored by 16.5. Again, I think it'll be closer than that. Maybe Ole Miss pulls away late, but I think they get the job done, which is ultimately all that matters here. And then the primetime game on Saturday, Oregon, James Madison in the first round. This one, Oregon is a 20.5-point favorite. James Madison losing their head coach as well. He's staying around. Same with Tulane, actually. I think Oregon handles this. I imagine Oregon being healthier than they were at the end of the season. And I think a healthy Oregon is a dangerous team, especially given how their first college football playoff, 12-team college football playoff went. And Buckeye fans need no reminder about that, having watched the Buckeyes demolish the Ducks in the Rose Bowl last year. So I think Oregon will be certainly motivated for this game. And then I just think they're more talented, especially if they can get healthy. I saw that some of their receivers were questionable coming into the game. It would not surprise me if they get if they get some of those guys back and look much more like the Oregon team earlier in the season than the one we saw late in the year. So then we go to the quarterfinals, and that will kick off in the Cotton Bowl, Ohio State against Miami. If you want to call it a rematch of the 2002 national championship, these two teams have played since then. But I assume that narrative will come up, even though I doubt I'd have to do math on this, but I imagine many of these players, if not all of them, were not even alive at that point. I don't know, how old are these? What year were these kids born? I'd have to do the math, and I'm not good at math. I think Miami, again, if they are on their A game, I think they can give Ohio State some trouble. But ultimately, I think Ohio State's too talented. As I've talked about before, I think this will be a motivated Ohio State team coming out of the Big Ten championship game loss and wanting to prove, hey, we're still the best team in the country, even after that loss. And I think the committee, by only dropping them the one spot, while I do think it's a more difficult path to the semis, I think recognizes like, hey, this team's really good. And so I think Ohio State will handle business there. I don't know what the line would be if those two teams played. I'm sure Ohio State would be a favorite, especially given they are not playing in Miami, which could have been a possibility here. Though Columbus or Ohio State fans, could have taken that stadium over even in Miami. So Buckeyes move on to the semifinals. The next game is January 1st, New Year's Day. The noon game will be Texas Tech against Oregon. Probably the most compelling game of the quarterfinal round. Obviously, that's a 4-5 matchup. I will admit, I have not watched a ton of Texas Tech. I think I only watched one full game this year. I think they have a talented defensive line, can cause some issues. I just think if Oregon's healthy, they are going to be really tough to beat. And again, a motivated Ducks team. Dante Moore out, maybe trying to prove not only that he can go on and try and win a national championship, but maybe still deciding on that NFL draft, have a good few game run here and see where your stock is. Again, those weapons back, that offensive line maybe being a little bit healthier. I think that Oregon can do enough, but I think this would be a really close game, most likely. Again, another fun one on New Year's Day when you wake up after celebrating the Buckeye win on New Year's Eve. Then we move on to Indiana and Oklahoma. That would be in the Rose Bowl. It'll be interesting to see for me how Indiana handles this. This is not something that these players and teams are used to. Players and coaches are used to. Yes, they played in the first round of the College Football Playoff last year, but that was a game where I don't think many people expected them to win. They were, the underdog. They were on the road. You're the number one team in the country. For the first time ever, Indiana is playing a football game as the number one team in the country. The expectations, I've talked about it before with Ohio State and how do you handle these 3.5 weeks in between ramping up? Well, I think Ohio State gets something extra by having lost the Big Ten championship game. Indiana, I'm questioning, do you do all of the little things that you need to do to be ready for this coming in as the number one team? With that said, though, I still think Indiana, one of the top 2-3 teams in the country, probably top 2 teams in the country, based on what we saw in the Big Ten championship game. So I have Indiana taking down Oklahoma, getting a playoff win, and moving on to the semifinal. And then the nightcapper on New Year's Day, Georgia against Ole Miss. Interesting, I think, to some degree. I would be more interested if Ole Miss had its staff in place. These two teams did play another rematch earlier this season. They played, when was that game? I should have had this all done. They played October 18th. Georgia won 43-35. It was a big day for Gunnar Stockton, threw for 289 yards, 4 touchdowns. Trinidad Chambliss, the Ole Miss quarterback, was not as good. Had 263 yards, but 1 touchdown. he did have 2 rushing touchdowns. Q on Lacey, their running back, only 31 yards, but had 2 touchdowns as well. So Georgia just sort of outlasted them, 17 points in the fourth quarter. Other than that, it was a pretty close game. Remembering back on it, I'm just pulling up to make sure I remember. Yeah, Ole Miss was up 35-26 with 4:12 to play in the third quarter. So a pretty good game. I think that this is where not having your head coach and some of your coaching staff really comes into play, and you see Ole Miss struggle. I still think it could be competitive. I don't think this would be any sort of blowout, but I've got Georgia moving on to the semifinals to face Ohio State. Moving on to that semifinal game, as that will be on January 8th at 7:30 p.m. If you remember last year, that was the Ohio State played in the second of the 2 semifinals. So this year's a flip. They will now play in the first. That will be in the Fiesta Bowl, the rematch of the playoff semifinal from 2022. Ultimately, I think that this game comes down to the defense. And I think Georgia's defense is not at the elite level it once was. It doesn't have the players that it did when Kirby Smart's team was winning back-to-back national championships. I think Ohio State's defense, assuming it plays the way it has all year, even in the 1 loss to Indiana, is just too good. And I think that's the difference in this game. I think that even if Ohio State's offense isn't at its best in these playoff games, like if you can score 3 touchdowns, 24 points, I was talking with somebody about this earlier, you get to 24 points, which Ohio State did in all but 2 games this year. Now, you will say those were the 2 games against the 2 best teams they played. Texas only scoring 14 points, and then obviously against Indiana only scoring 10. To me, though, and the reason I have confidence that the Buckeyes can get to 21, 24 points is the issue against Indiana wasn't that the offense couldn't move the ball, right? It was that the offense couldn't finish those drives. And I think that the Buckeyes will have spent so much time on, hey, let's clean up the red zone issues. Let's figure out ways to get this to work in the red zone over these few weeks, enough that you can overcome the issues that causes you problems in the Big Ten championship game, get to that 21, 24 point margin there. And, the ability for Georgia to outscore Ohio State, like this, to me, doesn't have the makings of a 2022 game. Georgia 33rd in the country with 31.9 points per game. Ohio State is 18th at 34.9. So, look, I know Georgia's defense is better than most of the teams Ohio State played, probably everyone except Indiana, maybe Texas at the time. But for me, I think that the Buckeyes ultimately are able to get enough stops. I think this offense will move the ball enough, and they are heading back to the national championship game for the second year in a row, which is crazy to think about because you have the chance to do something that has never been done before in Ohio State history. But who will the Buckeyes play? The January 9th game, that game's also at 7:30. In my estimation, a Big Ten matchup between Indiana and Oregon. This is probably the other game I deliberated about the most when thinking through just kind of all of these games. We saw this game already, as people will remember. It was a great one. The same weekend, I think it was same weekend Ohio State played Illinois. Indiana went to Oregon on October 11th and won 30-20. At that point, Oregon was starting to get a little banged up. They still had most of their weapons. Fernando Mendoza had 215 yards and touchdown, 1 interception. Dante Moore, 186 yards, not his best game. In fact, that may be one of his worst passing games. 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. Let's look at Dante Moore here. He had 186. He had 178 against Northwestern, but that was a pretty convincing win. 2 interceptions. The only time all season he threw 2 interceptions was in that game against Indiana. So turning the ball over obviously will be crucial. For me, I think, again, with Oregon, this is going to be a motivated team. I think Dan Lanning will have them fired up for this run. And you have the revenge factor that Ohio State used just a year ago, right? To overcome Oregon. So I think the Ducks get it done. I think it'll be a really good game. I think it could come down to the fourth quarter and who can make a play there. I will not be surprised if Indiana gets back, but I think the Ducks use that motivation and get a win in the rematch heading into the national championship game, January 19th, 7:30 p.m. on ESPN. It's a matchup we saw twice last year, Oregon, Ohio State. In fact, it's a matchup we've seen a few times in the last few years, and one that we hadn't seen much of before then. I'm just pulling up the history here. Yeah, so they're supposed to play in 2020, played in 2021. Obviously, that's the Oregon win in Columbus. Then the game last year in Eugene, 32-31. And then the Buckeyes dominate 41-21 in the College Football Playoff quarterfinal at the Rose Bowl last year. At this point, I think given this is an Ohio State podcast, it would be a shame of me to not pick the Buckeyes. I mean, I think from the beginning of the season, we've been talking about the chance for the Buckeyes to repeat as national champions. I think Oregon's going to be a difficult team, no doubt about it. But again, for me, this defense is just so good. What Matt Patricia and this group has done, I think can do enough to neutralize the Ducks, assuming the offense. And to get this far, I have to think that the offense is playing at a level like it did most of the season. And for me, I think that that's enough to get the Buckeyes to their second straight national championship. If I were, if you're asking me for sort of a non-homer pick, I try not to be a homer when looking at these things, but something different. I think obviously Georgia has the path to get in, and if I had to pick if you want an off-the-wall pick, I guess Georgia Texas Tech was one I thought about quite a bit as sort of if I were filling out NCAA tournament brackets. That's one, if I had multiple, that's one I might consider. So, I think that would be, say Ohio State loses to Georgia. I could see Texas Tech beating Oregon and beating Indiana, just if we're looking for something a little different. But yeah, I think that's the way I would predict it to go. Buckeyes getting back to the national championship and all Big Ten national championship game, which would be a big kicking the what to SEC people everywhere. That'd be 3 straight Big Ten national championships, which, again, I don't think SEC people would love too much, but fun for those of us in Big Ten country. So, yeah, that's the way I've got it. We'll see. I'm excited for the playoff. I'm excited to watch these games this weekend. Last year was different. I got to watch the Friday game. I got to see some of the games earlier on, but then it was to work ahead of that Tennessee game. And you guys all know how that went. So I'm excited to get this weekend to kind of sit back, watch these teams, get a sense of each team kind of coming out of this layoff, so to speak, this time off. And then we're off and running. And look, last year, I think I've said this before on here. Last year, the covering that run to the national championship was exhausting. When I got back after the national championship game, I was sick for a few days. It took a lot out of me, and I've talked to other people, same thing, but it was awesome. No doubt about it. Got the chance to cover all of those games, cover a national championship. And I think I'll get to do it again. I think you'll get to watch it again. And I think the Buckeyes will be celebrating in Miami come mid-January. So that's going to do it. Again, kind of quick one today, but I just wanted to get this out before the College Football Playoff starts on Friday. Again, if you are watching this on YouTube, please make sure you turn on alerts, hit that bell, and make sure the notifications are on so that you get all of our videos. If you are watching this on your podcast on your podcast platform of choice, make sure you leave us a 5-star review and turn on notifications as well so you know when we drop our podcast. Anyway, thank you guys for tuning in. Again, I am Patrick Murphy from Bucknuts and 24/7 Sports, and we're talking college football playoff from here on out. Cheers.